Buenos dias. Good morning. Delighted to be with you. In case you were wondering who made the nasty smirk right there just 2 seconds ago, that was me. As I was taking control of the clicker, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I do want to warn you the last three times I presented so far this year, the clicker stopped working. So we managed, but I just want to warn you that, I seem to bring bad luck when it comes to these things. Needless to say, we're here today to talk about where production is going to be at, and we're living in a highly convoluted world. Richard just alluded to it. We've got those things called semis, so we'll talk about what our outlook for semiconductors is going to look like. We'll talk about what other production constraints may be coming further down the road. And then, of course, we now have to start looking at the other side of the coin, which is the eminent word that starts with an R, particularly for the Northern Hemisphere, recession, also playing a role in 2023. So those are some of the topics that we will address today. My name, again, is Guido Vildozo. I've been with S&P Global for now 8 months, technically all predecessor companies for a little over 21 years. So I've done this. This is all that I've done throughout my entire career, and I look forward to your questions, or hopefully we'll create the need for some questions as we go through the presentation. Needless to say, and as I mentioned, I've been with this company for the last few months, and automotive is a critical pillar of what S&P Global wants to do. We are one of the divisions that was created. We have 3 different subsets within the division, and I belong to the one that is technically talking to OEM suppliers and logistic companies as far as to what may be coming further down the road. I've got responsibilities for not only the light vehicle sales forecast, but also our sales-based powertrain forecast as well, which I've been working on throughout the last 2 years. Having said that, this is a good time to mention that historically speaking, we've been primarily focused on economic drivers as a main means of working our forecasts. That shifted, and over the last 18 months, needless to say, production has been the main driver, and having a clear understanding of where we are at from semiconductor availability was critical. But our methodology looking outbound is completely different now, and we're heavily focused on this transition to an electrified world. We look at 4 critical pillars that help us better understand. The first and foremost, of course, is what is the regulation like in each country. And needless to say, if laws are changing and emission requirements are becoming more stringent, we need to reflect that within our forecasts. Number 2 is price parity. And price parity may come at a different point in time depending on what market you're looking at. Then, of course, we need incentives because battery electric vehicles are not competitive today. So that's the 3rd pillar right there. We're also looking at the different strategies that each OEM has, whether it's the likes of Nissan or Toyota, and what their different goals are or aspirations are, and those vary from OEM to OEM. And last but not least, infrastructure is the last one that we look at. As far as looking at the here and now, there's this event going on the other side of the world in Eastern Europe today, and it has implications, or it will have implications for the remainder of the decade. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, we basically set a whole chain of events that affected raw materials. Agricultural raw materials, you may say, well, why is that relevant from an automotive standpoint? Well, because we created inflation. And once we create inflation, we obviously hit disposable income when it comes to consumers. Secondly, of course, raw materials that are used within the automotive industry: iron ore, aluminum, palladium, nickel, carbon black, and neon gas. I want to highlight 2 of those elements right here. Palladium, 40% of all palladium comes out of Russia. There's about 4 to 7 grams of palladium that go inside of each catalytic converter. So it's a very critical raw material that we need. You may say, well, if 40% of that comes out from Russia, how are we going to meet all of these different emission requirements that we're talking about throughout the world? We can shift, or it's an easier shift for those vehicles that are propelled by gasoline. So roughly about 50% of those 4 to 7 grams can be replaced by platinum, which comes from another friendly country called South Africa. Needless to say, completely stable, but that's another region from where we source platinum. And then, of course, we've got neon gas. And as mentioned before, that infamous word called semiconductors. Why is neon gas relevant? Because we weld those fobs to the motherboards with neon gas, and roughly about 40% of all the neon gas that is used for welding in the semiconductor industry around the world used to come out of the Ukraine. This is less of an issue for us, or per conversations that we've had with both Intel and Taiwan Semi, less of an issue. Both of them had 6 months supply at the time of the invasion, and the goal was to basically be able to replace some of that production in other countries such as India and China. It's not a situation where it's exclusive to the nation, it's just who wants to get dirty with the process. So at least for now, it appears to be that neon gas will not be a challenge, but we would be finding that out at this point in time. And last but not least, of course, energy, oil and gas. Not only is the inflationary impact of oil and gas significant in Europe, but obviously it hurts the wallet, and it may accelerate this transition that we are looking at from essentially a internal combustion engine world to a electrified world. So that has changed, and just to give you an idea of how much this has changed, our outlook for Brent has gone from being roughly $60 to $65 per barrel around 2025 to $80 to $85 today. So that's certainly much higher, roughly about 30% higher than anyone anticipated it to be. And that, of course, has a chain event when it comes to a domino effect, when it comes to inflation and disposable income and the like. So that, in a summary, is what happened on that particular side of the world. From a raw materials perspective, you can see that prices went up for most metals. They are coming down, there's no question about it, but we don't anticipate that those prices are going to be coming back down to levels comparable to what we had in 2019. Why is this significant? Because it means that the overall pricing structure for vehicles is going to change in the future. And you can see that here. Whereas historically, we've been used to seeing price increases of roughly about 2 to 3% per year on the manufacturing of vehicles. And this is, again, input prices, not necessarily what the consumer is seeing. So from a input price perspective, we've been seeing a 2 to 3% increase historically over the last 20 years. And what we are going to see throughout the next couple of years will be roughly 6 to 8%. That translates, and we're using Europe here as an example, that translates into a transition of vehicle pricing to roughly about 36,000 euros from 30,000 euros presently in 2022. That's roughly a 20% increase that we're going to see in a very, very short time frame. So needless to say, this has implications because obviously vehicle prices are going to be a lot higher than what we originally anticipated them to be. And that means that we would be selling less vehicles, and you'll see that coming up within a few more slides. So needless to say, important element as far as to how this domino effect is playing out from the invasion of the Ukraine back in February to what we should anticipate from light vehicle from a pricing perspective for light vehicle sales. Also relevant, let's talk about semiconductors, because needless to say, semiconductors have been king over the last 2 years. We initially thought that the constraints that we were seeing from a production standpoint was primarily due to the fact that semiconductors were going into mobile devices. It was because everyone needed an iPad, an iPhone, everyone was working at home throughout the time of the pandemic, but that wasn't necessarily the case. What actually happened was the companies that mostly focused on production of semiconductors focused on building semiconductors for small devices, handheld devices, which means that those semiconductors had to be very, very small. The automotive industry uses the semiconductors that are much bigger, and you can see that those are highlighted under the red section in this chart. We can use bigger semiconductors in the automotive industry because we're not as constrained with space. The problem is none of the semiconductor manufacturers wanted to invest in those semiconductors because they're cheap. You know, which one would you rather build? Would you rather build a $6 cheap semiconductor for a window opener, or would you rather build a $300 semiconductor for an iPhone? The decision is clear, and as a result, roughly about 80 to 85% of all of the investment that these companies made was focused on the smaller semiconductors, and as a result, there was very little investment that came in the expansion or the availability of larger, older analog semiconductors, which are the semiconductors that we use for automotive. Why is this relevant? Well, because back in 2017, we used about 700 chips per vehicle. In 2021, we were using already about 1,500 chips per vehicle. This year, we're using about 1,600 chips per vehicle. So we're using roughly about twice as many chips as we needed before. As a result, if you have a particular industry that has not necessarily invested in their supply of semiconductors, and production needs more semis because of the fact that we need sensors for parking, we need sensors for windows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then needless to say, we had a major constraint taking place with semiconductor availability. Also relevant was after the Lehman Brothers crisis, roughly about 70% of semiconductor production went out to suppliers. And most of these suppliers actually went to a third party called Taiwan Semi. So this is really how you start to see the sequence of events take place. There was very little investment that took place with the production of older semiconductors. Then suppliers themselves started to push their manufacturing to Taiwan Semi, and the automotive industry had very little visibility into how this was happening, and this is why it caught us all by surprise, essentially towards the end of 2020, when we realized that we can't come up with enough chips to build cars around the world. So as far as what will come in the not so distant future, we need to obviously look at what Taiwan Semiconductor will do, because they provide roughly about 70% of all of the chips that we use in cars today. What they have said is that they would roughly make 15% more chips for 2022. Now, if you bear in mind that they account for roughly 70% of the industry, that means that we would only have a jump of 11% in production. But then we also have to factor in the fact that when we're looking at a higher take rate of chips in vehicles today than we were before, that takes another 5 to 6% out of that 11% jump that Taiwan Semi is pursuing, which means that the realistic expansion that we will see in production for 2023 will be along the lines of 5 to 6%. Why is this relevant? Because as we are looking at 2023, there are no new plants that are going to be coming into operation when it comes to semiconductor availability. We've got one coming in from Intel in Phoenix, but that happens to be a plant that is primarily focused at more expensive chips. You may say, well, how much more will a car need when it comes to semiconductor availability? And this is relevant because as you're looking at battery electric vehicles today, we use about 2,200 to 2,400 chips per vehicle, meaning that we should anticipate that the demand for chips will continue to grow over the coming years. As a result, if we don't have more capacity coming into the pipeline in 2023, the availability that we see from Taiwan Semi is really the constraint that we are going to have. As of this point, they're targeting an expansion of 12 to 15% by really being creative with their existing capacity. But if we start to see that there will be an average of about 1,700 chips per vehicle in 2023, that the actual expansion rates that we will have will be very similar to what we are going through this year, which means that we will only see an expansion of about 6 to 7% when it comes to production as a result of availability. If you put that into perspective, we've lost roughly about 11.5 million vehicles as a result of the lack of semiconductor availability over the last few years. That's essentially what Mexico builds in 3 years. 3 years over the last year and a half. So this is very relevant as far as to where the automotive industry is going to go. So needless to say, we've spoken a little bit about semiconductors. Let's start to talk about how that element of inflation, which I alluded to earlier, as far as the invasion of the Ukraine, how that plays out into a new notional demand forecast, because production hasn't been aligned with demand. Demand was here, production was here, we couldn't build enough. So in theory, now we have to have an understanding of what that demand looks like for the coming years, because what is about to happen with the Northern Hemisphere, essentially US, Europe, and Japan potentially going into recession in 2023, we are going to see an inversion. Supply will actually be higher than demand. So we need to have an understanding of how much unmet demand is left behind in order to have an understanding of what sort of road we are going to navigate over the coming years. So we'll talk about that over the coming months, but as if that were not enough, just this year alone, these are some of the elements that we have reflected within our forecasts as far as disruptors around the world. If you do a total tally of all of the disruptors here, it's 9 different impacts that we've had over essentially the last 6 months. As a result, yes, we're preparing for a recession. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be smooth sailing in 2023. Be prepared for significant volatility, whether that comes from a geopolitical standpoint, raw materials, whatever the case may be. It will be a highly disruptive world, much alike what we are seeing in 2022. As far as where are we going to go, and we've already alluded to this, inflation will take a bite out of light vehicle sales over the coming years. How significant will that bite be? Well, it's a little over 10%. We've taken out anywhere between 10 to 8 million units for the remainder of the forecast horizon out through 2030. Essentially, we were anticipating that we were going to normalize at about 100 million units by 2025 or 2027. As you can see, that isn't happening anytime soon. If anything, where we will start to level off to volumes comparable to those that were taking place before the pandemic started back in 2019, around 2025, 2026. So drastically different world and drastically different recovery than what we were expecting for. And again, if we start to think about the fact that the 11.5 million units that we lost as a result of the lack of semiconductor availability over the last 18 months, is very close to what we have taken out of the forecast. This means that we've essentially taken out 2 years of production per year, 2 years of production in Mexico per year out of our global light vehicle sales forecast outbound. And it's a combination of things. It's a combination of sanctions in Russia, as you can see on the far right. It's a combination of inflation, but then to a certain extent, the lack of semiconductor availability in the short term. As mentioned earlier, we won't have any significant capacity expansions in 2023. As far as Mexico is concerned, and let's start to bring this analysis closer to home. And in order to do that, we need to understand what is actually happening from a sales perspective in North America. And needless to say, 2022 has been a very difficult year for sales, light vehicle sales in North America. We've seen contractions relative to last year, both in the US and Canada. The only market within North America that is growing is Mexico from a sales perspective. And the only reason why we're seeing that is due to the fact that we now have supply of Chinese vehicles or sales of Chinese brands in Mexico. So this is why Mexican sales can buck the curve, but needless to say, if that wouldn't have happened, we would have been on the same boat as its other 2 peers, the US and Canada, where we're looking at a market below 14 million units for the US and below 1.5 million for Canada, with a very slow recovery taking place over the next few years. And you can see what the impact of that demand destruction that is about to come as a result of inflation and a recession over to the right side. Again, 10 to 12% in the short term and closer to 5 to 6% outbound. Now, in order to have a better understanding of what will actually happen in Mexico, we need to focus primarily on the largest market, which is the US. And this chart is a little convoluted, but let me try to navigate this chart as best as I possibly can. The blue line here represents our synthetic forecast for production. So that's essentially what car companies around the world are going to build for the US over the coming years, this blue line right here. The green line represents what we have actually sold, meaning, okay, this is what we were constrained with when it came to building vehicles, plus inventory, because obviously the US has one of the largest inventories around the world. So the green line essentially reflects what we have been able to sell, and it will also reflect what we anticipate will be sold. However, if you look at the macro data, which is highlighted here in red, we would have been able to sell a lot more cars than what we actually did. So we've technically have a bank or savings of roughly about 2.5 million units for the US as a result of the fact that if we think about how much consumers would have been able to buy relative to how much we actually sold, we have that for the future. That's very common for the US. It's a stable market, so we need to have a very clear understanding of what is happening from a sales perspective in the US. As far as looking outbound, a recession would essentially say that next year we would have only been able to sell 14.2 to 13.8 million units under normal circumstances. However, because we have some of this unmet demand or this bank of roughly 2.5 million units, we start to push that back towards the consumer. Now, you may say, how quickly are you going to push that back into the marketplace? Will it be 12 months, 18 months, because that's normally what happens when consumers are waiting. However, given how high interest rates are at, you've seen comments from Chairman Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, as far as interest rates going up. Given all of those changes, we shouldn't anticipate that a large part of that unmet demand will be coming back in 2023. But if anything, it will be 24, 25, 26. So that is reflected on the charts that you see in front of you today. It also anticipates that we will lose some of those 2.5 million units. We will lose roughly about 500,000 units of that unmet demand over the coming years. So that sort of lays the ground as far as to what we are expecting from a sales perspective. And you just heard from the folks that were here before me that electrification is going to be a large element when it comes to the automotive industry. This is the largest change that we are going to see since the car was invented. This is the largest change that is going to happen in the last 100 years. Over this time period, what we've done is we've done small incremental improvements to a vehicle, but we have never essentially said, let's change the technology completely, and particularly within a time frame as short as what we are about to see over the coming years. There's roughly about $500 billion of investment that are going to be coming in from OEMs around the world this decade, 350 of which are going to happen now. The result is roughly about 1 out of every 3 vehicles built in about 5 years' time will be electric, and roughly about 5% of global production will be plug-in hybrid vehicles. So drastic change. 40% of everything that will be built will be mostly electrified, if you so wish to call it. And you can see that the main regions where this is going to happen will primarily be China, Europe, and to a larger extent, the US. So that gives you an idea of how the manufacturing is going to happen when we are starting to look at electric vehicles further down the road. Now, how does that translate into, we're seeing a ramp up of electric vehicles. We know that we're going to be supply constrained when it comes to manufacturing. Well, we will essentially be climbing back towards 90 million units over the next few years, meaning that if we start to use that as a base, 90 million units, and then think about 40% of that by 2028, being electrified, we're talking about roughly 40 million vehicles being electrified by 2028. So that's a significant number. That's 10 times what Mexico builds in a year as far as to what the build rate of primarily battery electric vehicles is going to look like. So this is definitely going to impact your desk and your work in a not so distant future. So do not underestimate this transition that is taking place here right now. I know we focus heavily on saying, well, the infrastructure is not here today. Yeah, we understand that. But we also need to talk about the fact that there's $500 billion of investment coming in here, and that tells us a completely different storyline. There should be no constraints. There will be hurdles along the way, but we will be selling a larger part of vehicles in a electrified form in a not so distant future. As far as North America is concerned, you will see that our forecast gradually climbs back up to 16 million units. This number is actually relatively conservative relative to what we used to build before. If you talked to my counterpart on the production side, Joe Langley, he would have normally told you that a good year or a standard year when it came to North America production was somewhere between 16.5 to 17 million units. So from what you can see here on this chart, what comes up ahead over the next few years will actually be below that. And this is relevant because we need to remain profitable in a market where we are going to be building less. So important and significant distinction as we're looking or should anticipate as far as what we're looking from a production standpoint. And as you can see from a monthly perspective, which is the here and now, because obviously we live in a world of volatility, we will essentially be moving sideways before we start to grow at some point in time in mid-2023. And the reason why we start to grow is due to the fact that Intel will have a plant for semiconductors, high-end semiconductors, coming into operation at that point in Phoenix, and that should alleviate some of the bottlenecks that we are seeing for North America. As far as inventories, and this is another important element because obviously up to this point you've been able to go back to the car companies and say, well, my costs are up, whether it's raw materials, whether you're paying from a logistics standpoint, if you're paying more for fuel, or if you have to pay more for labor. It hasn't been an issue because inventories were depleted. As a result, the margins that we had were very, very high. Well, guess what? That's about to change. We've already seen inventories grow over the last 4 months. We bottomed out at about 1 million units in the month of June, and we're currently sitting at about 1.4 to 1.5 million units in inventory. And the industry would like to go back to somewhere between 2 to 2.2 million units at some point in time in the future. They will not go back to that 3.5 to 3.7 million unit number that we used to see as normal before, because of the fact that in order to do the upkeep on that number, we have to reduce margins drastically. So essentially, by constraining inventories and constraining that to 50 to 55 days, we are able to carry better margins that we have in the past. However, that normalization of the industry, which many anticipated would take many years, we were talking about 24, 25 as a normalization phase, will actually be happening by mid-year next year. At the pace that we're going, we've increased about 100,000 units per month of inventory. We're sitting at 1.45. To go back to 2, we are talking about another 5 to 6 months of inventory before we hit that normalization point. And as a matter of fact, some of those OEMs are there today. If you start to ask us, well, who's going to be impacted first? The Detroit 3. The Detroit 3 are definitely at that harmonization level of roughly about 100-day supply, 105-day supply. I'm sorry, not 100. It's 105 in our index, which means that is the equivalent of 55-day supply for OEMs. So the Detroit 3 are definitely there today. And, depending on what client you're working from or with, the storyline is completely different. The Asian OEMs are certainly still in a phase where they need to catch up when it comes to inventory, but not necessarily the same story when it comes to the Detroit 3. Let's talk a little bit about battery electric vehicles when it comes to North America, similar to the global trends that we're going to see. Roughly about 1 out of every 3 vehicles being built in the next 5 years will be a battery electric vehicle. So that's definitely coming. You can't say that this is a situation that is unique to the rest of the world. We're seeing less momentum when it comes to BEVs in Mexico. Most of this is really primarily geared at the US, but that is due to the fact that battery electric vehicles are heavy. So from a logistics standpoint, you want to build them where you sell them. However, as we start to build smaller battery electric vehicles, and there's a lot of those vehicles coming, there's over 250 battery electric vehicles that are going to be coming out over the next few years. As those vehicles are coming and as we start to build smaller vehicles, those vehicles are going to have to land in Mexico. So definitely an opportunity as far as the considering logistics and getting some of those vehicles out of Mexico towards the US. Also mentioned earlier, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which already built up on a complicated piece of legislation, which was the USMCA. So we're already working with trying to normalize to the higher regional content that we had as a result of USMCA that has resulted in roughly about $1 billion of investment of nearshoring or reshoring just in Mexico alone as Asian companies set up shop here. And now we've got to worry about these requirements that are going to be coming in from the US government in order to qualify for the incentive to sell battery electric vehicles in the US. Essentially, what the US government has just issued, or what they issued in the month of August, was we will give you $7,500 or we will give the consumer a $7,500 discount for the purchase of a battery electric vehicle through December 31st of 2032. Only country in the world to do that. Everyone else is phasing out their incentives when it comes to battery electric vehicles. The US is actually extending them out into the future. But it comes with significant pieces of fine print. The first and foremost is, what is the price of the electric vehicle? If it's a passenger car, it needs to be below $55,000. If it's a light truck, it needs to be below $80,000. Then only people with a certain income will be able to qualify for those vehicles. And we think that looking at US light vehicle sales today, roughly about 60 to 70% of new car buyers would be able to qualify for this particular piece of legislation. As if that were not enough, here comes the complicated part. You need to build the vehicle in North America. So many OEMs, particularly Asian OEMs, were thinking about building those vehicles in Japan or Korea. Now they have to reconsider that, but they can't do that overnight. That's going to take a few years. And because whomever wrote this piece of legislation is brilliant, they added 2 more pieces. You have to have the minerals come in from a non-foreign entity, which means anyone but China, India, or Russia, essentially at this point in time. And also, the country needs to have a free trade agreement with the US. For critical minerals, we're going to have a requirement that starts at 40% in 2023, gradually climbing up to 80%. And then there's a requirement for battery components starting at 50% in 2024 and climbing to 100% by 2029. So the minerals need to come from a country with an FTA with the US, and the battery components have to have a similar storyline, which obviously creates a disruption for how some of this is going to work out, because roughly about 70% of lithium is processed in China today. So this opens up an opportunity for many, many countries around the world to be able to pick up on some of that momentum which is currently taking place in China. As far as the list of vehicles that would qualify, we have about 120 battery electric vehicles, or ZEVs, zero-emission vehicles being sold in the US today, but only a handful of those vehicles would qualify just by being built in North America presently. And this is a list that was actually published by the Department of Energy. You will notice within this list, there are select vehicles that will not meet the price requirement. Lucid, for example, Some of the Tesla models will not meet that requirement. The Hummer certainly does not meet that requirement. The Hummer starts at about 105, way over the $80,000 price cap that we have on light trucks. So needless to say, this is a piece of legislation in progress. We are going to see some constraints as far as to how this will be executed. The IRS is the government agency responsible for it, but it needs input from both the Department of Energy as well as the National Highway NHTSA, National Highway Transport Safety Administration, to be able to operate, because they need to tell them, is this a passenger car, a light truck? Does it meet the requirements? It doesn't meet requirements. So it's going to take a little bit of time before we start to level off some of those elements over the coming years. So I wanted to save this slide for last, because we've spoken about global sales, we've converged over to global production. We understand what the impact of propulsion will be, but how much are we going to build in Mexico? Roughly about 4 million units coming further down the road. It's going to be an increase relative to what we are seeing today. But if we start to think about the roughly $30 billion of investment that came in over the last decade in capacity expansion in Mexico, that number is actually shy of the total 6 million units of installed capacity we're going to see in a not so distant future, the moment that Toyota Guanajuato becomes operational. So needless to say, yes, production is certainly coming back into the pipeline, but we won't be close to what the total installed capacity is going to look like for the country. As a result, let me wrap up very quickly here. We've essentially gone from being worried about the pandemic to semiconductor availability, now really focused on inflation and the impact that we will see as a result of demand destruction. We hope that we can offset some of that hit that we're going to have as a result of demand destruction through notional demand, but needless to say, affordability is going to come into the pipeline. Vehicles are going to be a lot more expensive. The recovery is going to vary depending on what region we're looking at. And needless to say, the challenges are certainly going to be here. When we're thinking about North America as a whole, we have to be mindful of what is happening, for example, with the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got presidential elections in both countries, US and Mexico, in 2024. So needless to say, we still have a few more hoops to jump through. You guys are highly qualified. You managed to navigate the pandemic and many other crises before. I'm quite confident you will do just fine. And if there's anything that we can do to assist, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our account manager is here, Irina Sanchez. So feel free to reach out to her. She's local, actually, well, sort of local, up in Toluca. You won't find me here. I'm based out of Boston, but Irina is here regularly, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Here's to a fruitful 2023. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your chat. It was great. I just have a question. Could you please elaborate a little more about the labor situation? If there's a recession coming and a lot of companies are going to be cutting people, why the labor situation is going to remain in 2023?
That's a great question, and I think I don't know if you're in finance or accounting, because it sounds like you are, but when we're looking at labor, it's going to hit us two ways. Obviously, unemployment, which is really where your question is coming in from, and that's reflected within our forecast. This is why we're starting to talk about what notional demand would look like, somewhere between 13.8 to 14.2 million units in the US, but also very relevant from a cost standpoint for companies in the region as a whole. I think this is going to be the largest challenge we're going to have. Talking to some of you over the last few months, a 6 to 8% increase when it comes to wages at a bare minimum for 2023. And that's a challenge, when you're looking at constrained inventories, the fact that vehicle prices won't be able to go up as much. Unemployment is going up in the US and other parts of the world, but then you also have to pay your unions more. So that's a great question. Thank you for your question. Hope I answered your question, and hopefully that addresses the need for most of you. Thank you.